For 3,000 years, the Velkarath Empire had hunted across the galaxy, cataloguing species the way museums catalogued fossils. They watched prey flee. They watched prey hide. They watched prey surrender. Never in all of recorded history had they witnessed prey that fought back with the kind of desperate creativity that made survival not just possible, but inevitable. What they didn't understand about humans was that humans weren't built to survive. They were built to adapt, to innovate, to turn their weakness into weapons. And when the Velkarath looked into the eyes of their captive, the first human they'd ever really examined up close, they saw something that made their three hearts skip. They saw intelligence. They saw rage. They saw a creature that would rather burn the entire galaxy down than accept slavery. That single moment, when the Velkarath realized what they'd actually captured, was when everything began to fall apart. This is the story of what happens when predators mistake patience for weakness. The observation deck of the Velkarath carrier ship Eternal Conquest stretched across 3 levels, a cathedral of chrome and crystalline walls designed to showcase the Empire's power. Supreme Commander Vexrath stood at the center of it all, his elongated frame casting shadows across the polished floor. His scales shimmered with an iridescent blue that indicated contentment, the color of a hunter who'd just made a kill. Around him, hundreds of his subordinates worked at stations, monitoring the cargo hold far below where something extraordinary had been stored. Something that had sparked unprecedented interest among the scientific and military elite of the Empire. They had finally captured a human. For decades, the Velkarath had tracked the species across 3 galactic sectors. Humans were unusual in ways that defied their initial classifications. They were fragile compared to most sentient species, lacking natural armor, venomous barbs, or adaptive carapaces. Their strength was negligible. A Velkarath child could overpower 10 adult humans without breaking a sweat. Yet somehow, these creatures had managed to colonize 11 different star systems, establish trade routes across impossibly hostile space, and build weapons technology that, while inferior to the Velkarath arsenal, showed remarkable ingenuity for such a young species. Commander Vexrath found it amusing. Pathetic, truly, but amusing. "Status report," Vexrath commanded, his voice a gravelly whisper that somehow carried across the entire observation deck despite the volume of activity. A smaller Velkarath, his scales a dull grey indicating lower rank, scurried over with a data tablet glowing with bioluminescent text. "The specimen has been contained in Chamber 7, Supreme Commander. It appears to be in a state of hyperactivity. Our sensors indicate elevated heart rate, increased respiration, and what our biology team identifies as stress hormones flooding its system." The commander's lips curled upward in what passed for a smile among his kind. "Excellent. And the interrogation preparations?" "The chamber is equipped with all standard implements, sir. However, our xenobiology team suggests that physical torture may be ineffective. The human specimen's bone density is lower than anticipated, which means standard pain amplification techniques could result in death before we extract useful information." Vexrath made a sound that could have been a laugh or a growl. It was difficult to tell with him. "Then we shall have to be creative. Bring me the live feed. I wish to see what has sparked such fascination among our scientists." The walls of the observation deck flickered and shifted, displaying a massive holographic image of the cargo hold below. And there, in Chamber 7, was humanity's greatest weakness and greatest strength. Though Vexrath had no way of knowing it yet, the human was a male, approximately 28 years old according to their scanners, with dark hair and pale skin marked by recent bruising from their capture. His name, according to their databases, was Marcus Hayes. He was a structural engineer from the Earth colony of New Meridian. He had been on a solo survey mission when the Velkarath intercepted his vessel, disabling it with a single energy burst and collecting him like a specimen for a museum. Marcus paced the chamber in slow, measured steps. The cell itself was designed for creatures much larger than him, with walls of seamless metal that gleamed under artificial light. There were no visible doors, no obvious means of escape. The chamber was furnished with nothing but a small pool of water and a waste receptacle, the Velkarath's concept of basic prisoner care. But what the Velkarath cameras didn't capture was the way Marcus's eyes moved, cataloguing every detail. They didn't register his hand running along the wall, feeling for vibrations that only he could interpret. They didn't notice how he paced in patterns, measuring distances in his own mental mathematics. They didn't see the problem solver within him, already working on the puzzle of survival. Vexrath leaned forward, studying the human with the intensity of a collector examining a rare jewel. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Observe how it moves. There's almost a method to it. Does it perhaps understand that it's being observed?" "Unknown, sir," the grayscale technician replied. "The specimen's cognitive capabilities are documented, but we have limited data on human psychology under stress conditions." The commander made a decision. "Prepare an interrogation. I want to know the location of Earth. I want to know their military capacity. And I want to know why this species believes itself valuable enough to challenge the Velkarath. Bring it to interrogation chamber 3. Below, in his cell, Marcus stopped pacing. The low hum of machinery had changed its frequency just slightly. He'd been listening to the sounds of the ship since he regained consciousness, understanding that sound was information, and information was power. Something was about to happen. Something that would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise or died in this metal tomb. He sat down in the center of the chamber and took a deep breath. His hands trembled slightly, and he forced them to still. Fear was useful in small doses. It kept you sharp, kept you alert. But panic was the enemy of survival. His grandfather had taught him that during a camping trip when he was 8 years old, lost in the woods with nothing but his wits. "The moment you panic," his grandfather had said, "you stop thinking. And the moment you stop thinking, you're already dead." Marcus closed his eyes and began cataloging what he knew. He was on an alien ship. They were technologically advanced, militarily overwhelming, and utterly convinced of his helplessness. That last part was the most important, because it meant they wouldn't be expecting what came next. The walls of his cell began to glow with a soft blue light, and a section of the seamless metal irised open, revealing a corridor beyond. 2 Velkaraths stood waiting, their forms towering, their movements predatory. Without words, they gestured for him to exit. Marcus stood, steadied himself with a breath, and walked toward them. As he passed through the door and into the corridor beyond, he began his silent calculations. Ship dimensions, patrol patterns, structural weak points, all pieces of a puzzle that hadn't been solved in 3,000 years of Velkarath conquest. No captured species had ever escaped. No prey had ever turned hunter. But then again, the Velkarath had never encountered something with humanity's greatest weapon, the ability to look at an impossible situation and refuse to accept defeat. The walk through the corridor took him past observation windows showing the vast emptiness of space beyond, past compartments where Velkarath soldiers worked at stations, past armories containing weapons that could level cities. Each sight was filed away in his memory, each detail a thread that could eventually be woven into a rope strong enough to hang an empire. When they reached interrogation chamber 3, Marcus's heart was still pounding, but his mind was crystal clear. The Velkarath were about to make their first mistake. They were about to assume that humanity's intelligence was merely another trait to catalogue, measure, and find wanting. They had no idea that intelligence, combined with desperation and the absolute refusal to surrender, was the deadliest combination in the galaxy. Commander Vexrath waited in the observation deck, watching through high-definition sensors as the human specimen was brought into the interrogation chamber. The room was designed with maximum psychological impact, walls that could display any image, sound systems that could produce frequencies that induced pain, temperature controls that could range from freezing to unbearably hot. "Begin the psychological softening phase," Vexrath commanded. "I wish to observe this creature's breaking point." And below, as the chamber began its work, Marcus Hayes smiled slightly, because the Velkarath didn't know that humans had faced and overcome far worse than cold chambers and loud noises. They didn't know that humanity's greatest strength wasn't physical or even technological. It was something far more dangerous. It was the ability to survive, adapt, and turn every moment of suffering into a lesson. The Velkarath had made their first mistake when they captured him. Now Marcus would spend every moment ensuring they never captured another human alive. Because the moment the galaxy knew that one human had not just survived the Velkarath but fought back, everything would change. And change would be the Velkarath's undoing. The interrogation chamber was silent, except for the soft hum of its climate control systems, now set to a temperature just below comfortable. Marcus sat on a metal platform in the center of the room, his wrists and ankles secured by restraints that were far more sophisticated than anything he'd ever encountered. They sensed his struggles and distributed pressure accordingly, never cutting off circulation but ensuring impossible escape. Around him, the walls were blank silver, reflecting his own exhausted face back at him in distorted ways that would be disorienting if he let them. He wouldn't let them. Through a transparent section of wall, he could see movement in an observation chamber beyond. The tall alien with the shimmering blue scales stood there, watching with what Marcus had learned to recognize as predatory anticipation. This was the Supreme Commander, the one making decisions. Marcus had been processing the hierarchy since his capture, understanding that every species had its power structure and that structure could always be exploited. Specimen Marcus Hayes. A voice came through speakers embedded in the walls, cool and devoid of emotion. I am Commander Vexrath of the Velkarath Empire. You are now property of the Eternal Conquest, and your cooperation will determine your level of suffering. We require answers to specific questions. Provide accurate responses, and your existence will continue. Provide false information, and we will explore the limits of human pain tolerance. Marcus had prepared for this moment since his capture. He'd run through scenarios in his mind, not allowing panic to take hold. The key to surviving interrogation was something he'd learned from history. Study humans who had survived imprisonment, torture, and extreme conditions. They all had one thing in common. They had a reason to survive beyond themselves. They had hope. They had a mission. I understand, Marcus said, his voice steady. I'll answer your questions. There was a pause, and Marcus could almost feel the surprise radiating from the commander. Perhaps humans weren't supposed to comply this quickly. Perhaps the Velkarath expected more resistance. Tell us the location of your planet, Earth, the voice commanded. Marcus took a deep breath. He knew the answer they wanted, and he knew he should lie. But a complete lie would be discovered too easily. Instead, he would give them a partial truth, wrapped in a story that would plant a seed of doubt in their minds about the worth of capturing humans at all. Earth is located in the outer spiral arm, Sector A7942, he began, providing coordinates that were close enough to be verifiable but vague enough to cause endless searching. But I should tell you something. The location might not matter. People. We're not like other species you've encountered. We don't have a single unified government. We have thousands. We have competing nations, competing factions, competing ideologies. You can destroy one colony, capture 1,000 of us, and somewhere else another 1,000 will be rising up, building weapons, planning revenge. This is irrelevant, the commander replied, but Marcus detected something in the tone, a fraction of doubt. Your weapons are primitive. Your military is weak. We have exterminated species far more advanced than your kind. That's true, Marcus said, and he meant it. But did any of those species fight while they were lost? Did any of them adapt to new conditions on the fly? We once had people trapped in frozen wastelands and they didn't have technology. They had nothing. Within 100 years, they had built civilizations from nothing. We can do things with limited resources that other species would find impossible. There was silence. Marcus pressed on, understanding that he was playing a dangerous game, but also understanding that his only weapon was information. Specifically, information that would make them regret capturing him before they killed him. What I mean is, Marcus continued, we're not valuable to you as slaves. We're too creative, too adaptable, too unpredictable. Other species probably responded well to simple orders, clear hierarchies, straightforward labor. We don't work that way. We're the kind of species that will figure out how your doors work and open them when you're not looking. We're the kind of species that will find weaknesses in your systems and exploit them. We're the kind that, even if you broke every bone in my body, would spend my last moment trying to figure out how to hurt you back. Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus could picture the commander conferring with his advisors, debating whether the human's words held truth or were merely the desperate ramblings of a captive trying to bargain for his life. You speak with remarkable confidence for a creature dependent on our mercy, Vexrath finally replied. I'm not asking for mercy, Marcus said. I'm being practical. I'm telling you what you need to know to make a good decision. And the good decision is probably to kill me and move on. Because if you try to integrate humans into your empire or use us as a resource, you're going to discover that we're more trouble than we're worth. He could see movement in the observation chamber. The commander leaning back, studying him with what might have been newfound respect. Respect was something. It meant they weren't just looking at him as an animal anymore. You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, Vexrath said. Perhaps both. Tell me, Marcus Hayes, what would your people do if I destroyed one of your colonies? If I eliminated 5,000 of your kind in a single moment, an act of pure power to demonstrate dominance? Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had to be careful here. The commander was testing him, probing for weakness, and there was a weakness. Humans were tribal, emotional creatures who formed bonds. 5,000 dead would destroy something in the hearts of his people, but he couldn't let the commander see that it would be a meaningful loss. They would mourn, Marcus said quietly, and then they would fight. That's what we do. We have a long history of people committing terrible acts against other people, and the response is always the same. Grief becomes, rage becomes determination. You could kill millions of us, and millions more would rise up, not out of some noble sense of honor, but because survival is what we do better than anything else in the galaxy. You speak often of survival, the commander observed. Do you truly believe you have any chance of surviving beyond this interrogation? No, Marcus said, and he meant it. I think you'll eventually decide that I'm not worth keeping alive. But the knowledge I have, the information I've already given you about human nature, that survives. And that's the part that matters. Because somewhere out there, my people are learning that we can be captured, that we can be threatened, and that we should prepare accordingly. There was movement in the observation chamber. A sudden motion that suggested the commander had stood up. When Vexrath's voice came again, it carried an edge of something that Marcus interpreted as amusement. You are attempting to manipulate me with reverse psychology, the commander stated, suggesting that your death would be more beneficial to my purposes than your survival. You are poor at it. Maybe, Marcus admitted, or maybe I'm telling you the truth, and you're intelligent enough to see it. Either way, the outcome doesn't change. I'm not your property, Commander. I'm information, and information doesn't belong to anyone. It just spreads. The interrogation chamber fell silent then, the hum of climate control the only sound. Marcus sat in the restraints, every muscle tense, wondering if he'd pushed too hard, if his words had sealed his fate. But he realized that his fate had been sealed the moment he was captured. The only variable was whether he would spend his final moments as a broken, defeated thing, or as something that might, in some small way, change how the Vel'Karath understood humanity. After a long moment, the commander spoke again, and this time there was something different in his voice. Curiosity, perhaps, or the first stirrings of doubt. We will continue this interrogation later, Vexrath said. For now, you will be returned to your holding cell. We have much to consider regarding the species you represent. Perhaps, Marcus Hayes, you are not as worthless as we initially believed. The restraints released with a soft hiss, and Marcus stood, his legs shaky beneath him. As the guards escorted him from the chamber, he looked back one final time at the observation window where the commander stood. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Marcus saw something shift in the alien's expression. The first seeds of respect. The first acknowledgement that humanity might be more than simple prey. It was the smallest victory imaginable in a situation with infinite odds against survival. But small victories, Marcus knew, were how wars were won. Back in his holding cell, Marcus continued his silent work. Every moment in the interrogation chamber had revealed more about the ship, its layout, its power distribution systems, the patterns of guard rotation. The Vel'Karath were efficient, organized, and utterly convinced of their superiority. That last part was the critical error. Superiority bred complacency. Complacency bred opportunity. On the wall of his cell, invisible to Vel'Karath's senses because it was merely a hairline fracture in the metal, Marcus scratched a symbol using a jagged piece of metal he'd carefully worked loose from his restraints before they'd been removed. It was a pattern, a code, a message to any human who might come after him. We are here. We are watching. We will find a way. Somewhere in the Vel'Karath fleet, other humans were being captured, interrogated, and similarly breaking down the systems that held them. They didn't know about each other yet, but Marcus was going to ensure that they did, because the Vel'Karath's greatest weakness wasn't their inferior weapons or their limited adaptability. It was their absolute certainty that they were unbeatable. Humanity had spent millennia proving that species with nothing but determination and desperation could overcome impossible odds. And Marcus Hayes was about to remind the galaxy why that was true. In the observation deck, Commander Vexrath stared at the dark screen showing the human's empty cell and made a decision that would ripple through the Vel'Karath Empire like a stone thrown into still water. He would not execute Marcus Hayes, at least not yet. Instead, he would study him, understand him, figure out what made humans different from the countless other species that had bent before Velkarath power. It was a decision born from respect and curiosity, two things the Velkarath rarely extended to prey. But it was also a decision born from the subtle fear that the human had planted in his mind. The fear that human adaptability, human creativity, human refusal to accept defeat might be far more dangerous than any weapons system. The commander could not have known that this single decision, to keep Marcus alive for study, would eventually lead to the collapse of the Velkarath Empire itself. He could not have known that one human given time and resources to study his captors would become the architect of their downfall. But somewhere deep in his consciousness, in those moments after the interrogation, Vexrath felt the first tremor of doubt. And doubt, once planted in a conqueror's mind, grows like a weed through the cracks of absolute certainty. 3 months aboard the Eternal Conquest had taught Marcus Hayes more than any military academy could have. He was no longer a prisoner in the traditional sense. Commander Vexrath had granted him restricted access to certain sections of the ship, allowing him to move between his quarters and designated work areas under constant surveillance. The Velkarath reasoned that understanding human behavior in controlled environments would yield valuable data for their empire. What they didn't realize was that Marcus was conducting his own research, gathering intelligence that would eventually become the blueprint for human liberation. The technical library that Vexrath had allowed him to access was a goldmine. The Velkarath were confident enough in their dominance that they left vast repositories of information freely available to their lesser species. Ship schematics, power distribution maps, weapon specifications, and most importantly, the protocols that governed Velkarath military hierarchy. Marcus committed every detail to memory, not writing anything down where it could be discovered. Instead, he built a three-dimensional model in his mind, a living schematic of the ship's every system, every vulnerability, every potential weakness. What fascinated Marcus most was the Velkarath power system. The Eternal Conquest was driven by a fusion reactor of astonishing sophistication, the kind of technology that had taken human civilization millennia to approach. But like all Velkarath technology, it operated under principles of absolute redundancy and hierarchical control. Multiple backup systems existed, yes, but they all fed through a central nexus in the engineering deck. One skilled engineer with the right knowledge could potentially cause catastrophic failure. One human, in other words, could bring down an entire capital ship. He began to befriend the Velkarath technicians assigned to oversee his study period. He did this by being genuinely curious about their work, asking questions that displayed real intellectual interest rather than skepticism or challenge. Most species, he realized, were lonely in their certainty. They assumed dominance meant isolation, but what they actually experienced was separation from meaningful intellectual engagement. A Velkarath engineer who had spent decades installing the same systems over and over found profound satisfaction in explaining his work to someone who actually understood what he was doing and could appreciate the elegance of the design. One technician, a younger Velkarath named Sarken, became something approaching friendly. He showed Marcus advanced diagnostic systems, explained repair procedures, and in a moment of technical enthusiasm, walked him through the priority sequencing system that controlled which backup power systems engaged in case of emergency. Sarken had no idea that Marcus was memorizing every step, every numerical sequence, every procedural detail. In his quarters at night, Marcus would review everything, cross-referencing the information he'd gathered from multiple sources, building a comprehensive understanding of the ship's systems. He began to see the patterns that the Velkarath themselves no longer perceived because they had designed the systems with such absolute confidence in their own comprehension. But there was something else Marcus needed to understand before any plan could be executed. He needed to know how many humans the Velkarath were holding. He'd been alone since his capture, but his observations of the ship's logistics suggested that others had been taken. The food distribution systems, the waste processing, the oxygen production, all calibrated for a population larger than just 1 human and 1,000 Velkarath. There were others somewhere on this ship, and finding them was essential. It was during his 6th week of technical study that Marcus found his answer. He was in the lower maintenance decks with Sarken, ostensibly learning about the secondary cooling systems, when he noticed something that the Velkarath technician had glossed over. A sealed section of the ship, marked with priority locks and security warnings. Marcus asked about it casually, as though it were merely technical curiosity. "That's the deep storage," Sarken said, his scales flickering with what might have been discomfort. "We're not supposed to talk about it. Why? Marcus asked. Sarken glanced around, confirming they were alone. There are other specimens down there. The capturing teams have been bringing back one of each dominant species from various sectors. The commander wants to understand different biologies, different cognitive patterns. It's a containment facility. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, but kept his expression neutral. Other humans. There had to be other humans down there, which meant there were other people with skills, other perspectives, other capabilities. Together, they might actually have a chance. How many? Marcus asked quietly. I don't know exactly, Sarken said, and Marcus could tell he was uncomfortable sharing this information. But the biological support systems are calibrated for approximately 500 subjects. I shouldn't have told you that. 12 humans in a facility of 500. Marcus didn't know for certain there were humans in there, but the probability was high. 12 humans. If they were chosen the way he'd been chosen. Engineers, scientists, people with useful skills could accomplish far more than one. But getting to them, freeing them, escaping the ship, the logistics seemed impossible. That night, Marcus made a decision. He would escalate his relationship with Sarken. The Velkarath technician was young, reasonably intelligent, and clearly uncomfortable with the moral implications of holding intelligent beings as specimens. Marcus had observed enough species psychology to understand that not all Velkarath were committed to their empire's mission. Some merely served because they knew nothing else. Some served because they were afraid to resist. And some, like Sarken, served because they had doubts but no framework for acting on them. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus carefully cultivated his connection with the technician. He listened more than he spoke. He showed genuine interest in Sarken's personal history, how the young Velkarath had lost a clutch sibling early in life, how he'd never been quite as invested in conquest as his superiors expected. He spoke of humans with nuance, explaining that humans weren't the simpletons the Velkarath assumed them to be, that they had rich emotional lives, complex societies, and genuine consciousness every bit as real as Velkarath consciousness. It was dangerous work, the kind of manipulation that could get him killed if discovered. But it was also the kind of work that humans had been doing since the beginning of civilization, understanding other beings and appealing to their better nature. Finally, on a quiet maintenance shift when they were alone in a section of the engineering deck far from security cameras, Marcus took his chance. I know about the deep storage, he said simply. Sarken's scales went pale, the chromatic display of shock and fear that Marcus had learned to recognize. You shouldn't know about that. If the commander discovers that I told you, he won't, Marcus said calmly, because you're going to help me, and in return you're going to help yourself. The Velkarath Empire won't last another 5 years, Sarken. You can be part of the species that brought it down. Or you can continue serving a system that's already dying. You speak insanity, Sarken said, but his voice lacked conviction. I speak truth, Marcus replied. My people are already adapting to this. Even now, there are humans preparing for war. There are humans building alliances with species that the Velkarath have conquered, species with reasons to want you destroyed. The empire you've served your entire life is going to fall, and the only question is whether you fall with it or whether you choose something different. This was partly true and partly inspired guessing. Marcus had no way of knowing whether his people had actually discovered his capture, whether military responses were being mounted, whether other species were indeed forming alliances. But humans had a talent for creating their own reality through belief and action. If enough people believed something was true, they often made it true. Sarken was silent for a long time, his scales cycling through colors that suggested intense emotional conflict. Finally, he spoke. What would you need? That was the moment everything changed. Within 48 hours, Sarken had provided Marcus with detailed access codes to the deep storage facility. Within 1 week, Marcus had made contact with 3 other humans held in the containment section: a medical doctor named Sarah Chen, a military strategist named James Ortega, and an agricultural engineer named Yuki Tanaka. Each had their own skills, their own understanding of different systems. Together, they had something greater than the sum of their parts. They had a plan. The escape would require precision timing and the cooperation of at least 3 other Velkarath technicians that Sarken personally vouched for. It would require creating a cascading power failure that would disable the ship's containment and monitoring systems long enough for them to reach the hangar bay. It would require taking over a shuttle and jumping through the Velkarath's security protocols. It should have been impossible. But humans were the species of impossible. On the night they chose, Carefully calculated based on the guard rotation schedules that Marcus had memorized, the plan began. Sarken and another sympathetic Velcarath technician initiated a cascade failure in the secondary power systems, following Marcus's instructions precisely. The primary systems automatically engaged their backup sequences, which engaged their backup sequences, which engaged their backup sequences, until the entire power distribution network was in a state of cascading reboots. For 17 minutes, the Eternal Conquest was in controlled chaos. The deep storage facility went dark. Security doors unlocked. Alarms screamed throughout the ship but were overridden by the power failure cascades. It was in those 17 minutes that 12 humans moved through the corridors of an alien warship, guided by Marcus's perfect memory of its layout, heading toward the hangar bay where the shuttle awaited. Commander Vexrath was in his quarters when the alarm sounded. He experienced, for the first time in his long military career, a moment of pure confusion. This ship was infallible. The Velcarath were masters of technology and conquest. Systems did not fail. And yet the telemetry before him suggested that nearly everything was failing at once. By the time he reached the command deck to take control of the situation, the human specimen had already reached the hangar bay. By the time security forces were mobilized to intercept them, Marcus had already input the launch sequence. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the shuttle had already separated from the Eternal Conquest and was jumping to faster-than-light speed. Commander Vexrath stood in the observation deck, watching the point where the human shuttle had departed, and felt something he had never experienced before. Not just failure, but the recognition of a fatal error. He had kept one human alive for study, had allowed that human access to sensitive systems out of scientific curiosity, had believed absolutely in Velcarath's superiority, and in doing so, had become the architect of the beginning of his empire's end. The 12 humans who escaped the Eternal Conquest would spend the next 3 years making contact with other escape pods and prisoners held by other Velcarath ships. They would coordinate with species that the Empire had conquered and subjugated. They would share the technical knowledge they'd acquired about Velcarath systems, vulnerability patterns, and military strategies. They would become the foundation of a rebellion that would ultimately liberate 17 enslaved species and bring about the downfall of the Velcarath Empire entirely. But more importantly, they would tell their story. They would tell the galaxy that humans were adaptable, resourceful, and impossible to break. They would prove that a species composed of individuals bound by nothing but the desire to survive and protect their own could accomplish what entire military forces could not. In a tavern on a frontier world nearly a decade later, Sarah Chen sat with Yuki Tanaka and James Ortega, drinking something that vaguely resembled Earth beer and celebrating the 4th anniversary of the Velcarath Empire's official dissolution. Around them, members of a dozen different species raised their glasses in gratitude to the humans who had sparked the revolution. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if they'd just killed you?" Yuki asked Marcus, who had joined them at the table. Marcus smiled slightly. "All the time." But they didn't. They thought they were too smart, too strong, too superior to need to worry about one weak human. And that's always been the problem with empires. They stopped believing that their prey could ever become predators. Sarah raised her glass. To Commander Vexrath, then, the greatest strategic mind to ever accidentally destroy his own empire. They drank to that. And somewhere in the remnants of the Velcarath Empire in exile and disgrace, Commander Vexrath remembered the moment he first looked into human eyes and saw something he couldn't categorize or control. He had spent 3,000 years hunting prey across the galaxy, and it had never occurred to him that prey might hunt back. It was a lesson that cost him everything, and it was a lesson that would echo through the galaxy for 1,000 years to come. Never mistake patience for weakness. Never assume that any species is too inferior to eventually rise and destroy you. And never, ever give a human reason to believe that survival is the only acceptable outcome. Because humans would burn entire worlds to survive. They would sacrifice everything they love to ensure that others could be free. They were not the most advanced species in the galaxy. They were not the strongest. They were not the fastest or the most efficient. But they were the ones who wanted to survive badly enough to never, ever surrender. And that had made all the difference.